The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I've said before, and I even said yesterday when we were talking about the recent shooting in Parkland, Florida, that when President Obama was president of the United States, right after the Sandy Hook school shooting, we had 85 to 90% support for universal background checks, and we still didn't get them. So I'm skeptical about whether we're going to get them now. But what we did get during the Obama presidency was an Obama-era rule that made it just a tiny bit more difficult for people with suspected mental illness to buy a gun. The law wasn't even put in place until December of 2016, the last full month of President Obama's presidency. Now, you might be saying, well, David, why are you bringing up something that was made law in December of 2016? The reason I'm bringing it up is that Trump himself has been saying almost exclusively after shootings that the problem is not the guns themselves. In fact, he often will not even mention guns when he talks after a shooting about that shooting. Trump has been insisting that the problem is mental illness. But you'll recall that from very early on in Trump's presidency, Trump revoked the law that was passed while President Obama was president that made it more difficult for people with suspected mental illness to get guns. So let's take it step by step. Trump pointed to mental illness as the real problem with guns many times. He minimizes shootings by Americans and white dudes as they're just deranged nuts. And he did it after this week's shooting as well. I showed you this tweet yesterday. Remember that Donald Trump tweeted, "So many signs that the Florida shooter was mentally disturbed, even expelled from school for bad and erratic behavior. Neighbors and classmates knew he was a big problem, must always report such instances to authorities again and again." Yesterday, Trump made his first public comments after the shooting. He made a brief set of prepared remarks, and he said he is going to focus on the problem of mental health, not of guns.
Yeah, he's going to tackle mental health issues, which is the kind of thing you say about homework. You're going to tackle your homework.
Yes.
You know, like, I don't know if this problem is that simple.
It's not. But Donald Trump has been making it very clear that guns are not going to be what he addresses. It's going to be so-called mental health. Well, it turns out that in Donald Trump's second month in office, he repealed President Obama's law that expanded mental health considerations for gun background checks. The law that President Obama was able to pass added people who were receiving Social Security for mental illness, as well as people who were deemed unfit to handle their own finances, to the National Background Check database. The logic of it was, okay, if you're so disabled by mental illness that you're getting Social Security benefits for it, maybe you shouldn't have a gun. And Trump nullified that law just weeks into his presidency, yet he's now telling us the problem is mental illness and we've got to prevent mentally ill people from getting guns. Of course, when Trump did this in February of last year, the NRA cheered it. Now, I know it wouldn't actually have prevented this week's shooting, right? There wasn't anything in the shooter's background that would have prevented him from getting this AR-15 style rifle that he used anyway. But at what point can we hold people accountable for legislating the opposite of what they claim to want, right? This is an example of why it doesn't matter what Trump's true beliefs are. What matters is how he will legislate, because we've talked about how Trump has talked a lot about hire American and all this stuff. But in his business life, he always hires foreign workers at his resorts. We've talked about how it doesn't really matter whether Trump is actually pro-life or just pretending right now. We know he was pro-choice for like his first 68 or 69 years of his life. 2 years ago, all of a sudden, he's pro-life right before he runs for president. Even if we don't believe it, if Trump will kowtow to the March for Life as he did, if he's going to talk about and try to restrict abortion, that's what matters. And it's the exact same thing with guns. Whatever it is that Trump has said in the past, including being critical of the NRA, it doesn't matter, because what Trump is saying now as President Trump is what's actually going to impact policy. And it just so happens that Trump is also doing the opposite of what he claims to want, saying that mental illness is the problem and not the guns. But he also made it easier in February of 2017 for people with mental illness to get those guns. Very, very dangerous stuff. And listen, I just want the hypocrisy to end. That's really what I want here. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Joshua Jarvis. Thanks, Joshua, for being a David Pakman Show member. And today's sustaining member of the day is Nick Gelfand. I know Nick. Nick's a good guy, and he's been a member since January 25 of 2011. That's a long time. So thanks to Joshua and Nick. Sign up, join them. You too can be both a new member of the day and someday, some beautiful day in the future, a sustaining member of the day. But you got to sign up. You got to start the process somewhere. Start on the path at davidpakman.com/membership. Let's go to the phones at 617-830-4750. Our first caller will be from the 916 area code. Listen for your area code because you won't hear anything in particular when we go to you, but our next caller is from 916. Who's this?
Hi, David. This is Anthony calling from California. I actually have two questions.
All right.
First one is, I have a lot of difficulty talking to people who are right-wing or Trump supporters or really set in their ways. You know, I have a lot of family and friends, even out here in California, who are incredibly entrenched in their beliefs. And regardless of evidence or any kind of debate that we have with each other, even if we love and care about each other, it goes nowhere. It does nothing. And it is probably one of the most frustrating things because it's just this blatant ignorance that you just can't get past.
So what's the question part of it?
The question part is, how do you deal with these kinds of relationships with these people who have these terrible views, but they're involved in your daily lives? Yeah,
you've just got to make a decision as to whether, number one, you want to keep them in your daily life or not, assuming that you do because they're people you know and care about and presumably have a role in your life. You have to sort of agree that you're not going to talk about politics. That's a sad reality. But if the idea is just to be able to coexist in some more reasonable way, you basically have to take the don't talk politics at Thanksgiving thing that some families have to do and apply it to your year-round life. That's the only thing I can think of because you're already experiencing the frustrations and difficulties of it. I don't know what other possibility there is.
And the second question would be, what ramifications do you foresee if the Democrats don't do well this November?
Oh, you'll see an even more emboldened Trump and a it'll be seen as a mandate for Republicans to continue passing all sorts of crazy, crazy stuff. And that would be a disaster, particularly because in the midterms, typically you see the party that doesn't control the White House pick up seats. So I'm not even going to go there beyond that initial comment because it would be such a total unmitigated disaster that is very scary. Anthony, thank you so much for the call. I really appreciate it. We are taking calls at 617-830-4750. We are going to go next to, why don't we try the 513 area code? Caller from 513, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Simon. I'm from Ohio. I just had a question, or really wanted to know your thoughts on...
Good. Now, Simon, before we get to the question, we're not on speakerphone, right?
No, we're not. I'll try to speak
it sounds much better all of a sudden. Thank you.
I apologize. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the fact that there's a lot of like left-wing and progressive people that seem to actually be kind of, not ironically, but weirdly against the Russia issue. And you'd think that since they're so left-wing that they might be the first people to line up to take cause with that, but they seem to not be. Is there like a particular reason you might think that kind of counterintuitive?
Yes, the reason is that there's a contingent of the left. There's a contingent of the left, Simon, that is conflating Russian meddling in the election with Hillary Clinton being a better candidate than they thought she was. So in other words, there's a contingent that believes Bernie was the guy. and I voted for Bernie in the primary, right? And they believe that had Bernie faced off against Trump, Bernie would have won, that regardless of Russian interference, Hillary would have lost. And thus they see the Russia story as a threat to their worldview that Hillary was a terrible candidate and Bernie was a great one. And the thing is, you can believe that Hillary was a terrible candidate and that there's something to the Russia story, right? It's not one or the other. And I think that the inability to see that is really causing a lot of problems within the left. I don't think the left is super fractured. I'll talk about this later, but it is causing a problem within the left.
Do you think it's like counterproductive to their own kind of interests?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is, to the extent that it is a rift, it is absolutely counterproductive.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right, Simon, appreciate the call. Thank you. 617-830-4750. Let's go to our next caller. Let's try the 732 area code. And 732 has been a tough one for us. Sometimes 732 is really good, and sometimes 732 is difficult. So who's with us from 732 today?
Hey, it's Kyle. Sorry, I'll try to be better today.
Kyle, I was not talking about you, that I'm going to admit. Go ahead.
Thanks. So something I've been feeling recently over the past few weeks since the tax bill has passed is I'm starting to feel like maybe the scandals going on with the Trump administration might be trumped by, perceived economic gains by the voters, and it's starting to worry me. So is there any way you can make me feel like maybe people will actually go out and vote for Democrats or get this guy out in 2020?
No, I have nothing positive to tell you, unfortunately. You're spot on, which is that, listen, people started getting, depending on your income, started getting a few more bucks in your paycheck. Now, whether you'll ultimately end up paying a higher or lower effective tax rate is going to come down to other aspects of your economic situation. You won't know that, though, until as late as April 15th of 2019, which will be after the midterm election. You do see, even though disproportionately only the rich are really in the stock market in a very significant way, you still see sentiment about how the economy is doing tied up in the stock market. So we've had a big run up and that's been good, but then we had this pullback that could have been the early stages of a correction or the beginning of a mini recession. We still don't know, but then it's kind of popped back up and down. It's erratic right now. And I don't know that it's really impacting people's overall assessments of how the economy is doing. We did have a report earlier this week that inflation is starting to tick up, but we're talking about really small moves here. So I believe that just saying we did tax reform is going to bring more benefit to Republicans for 2018 than whatever sort of nuanced repercussions any one person can suss out from it. And I share your concern.
Yeah, just to clarify, though, do you think the voters will care more about the, the perceived economic gains from, whatever the administration does within the next year, or do you think the scandals will really play on their minds?
It's going to depend on which voters. The Trumpists are going to be more comfortable ignoring the scandals by saying, hey, he did taxes and I get an extra $25 in my paycheck. Whereas more people on the left are going to say, hey, wait, hold on a second. This was mostly a handout to the rich, and there's 20 other scandals going on. So I think it'll have a very partisan effect.
And as for the independents, then?
I'm sorry?
The independent voters, the swing voters in 18 and 20,
they're going to make a big difference, and who knows where they will go. It'll depend whether they're left or right leaning. But if the approval for Trump remains low, then those independents could end up pushing more Democrats into seats in November. Thanks for the call. Really appreciate it. Good question. I mean, it's good people are thinking ahead to the midterms because that's an issue that we need to be talking about. Where do we want to go next? Let's try maybe the 510 area code. Caller from 510. Go ahead.
Hello?
You're on.
Hey, David. Thanks for receiving my call.
Oh, my pleasure.
I just had a question. With the tax cut that they did, what was being paid with that money, and where does that apply?
What was being paid? What do you mean? You mean where did the money go?
Yeah, what was being funded with that money?
Oh, tax reductions. In other words, people are paying less in taxes and they are keeping it, and they're disproportionately rich people and corporations. I mean, they can do whatever they want with the money, and that's where part of the speculation as to the economic benefit is.
Yeah. I mean, that money was going into like the IRS or something, or
yeah, it was going
they were
it was
using
government revenue previously. When it was coming in, it was government revenue, and it became part of the budget, which we run as a deficit, of course.
All right. And so then, okay, that's I was wondering if they were previously had that money to fund programs, whether Republican or Democrat programs.
Yeah, I mean, it was just
cut
you can't say,
that money
right? I mean,
out,
it's like
so then,
tax revenue goes in and it funds government. So you can't say now the money that is going back to rich people from the tax cuts was only funding this program or that program. I mean, now we've got a new budget that's been submitted by the White House, and we have to see what eventually becomes the official budget. But it's not quite so simple. But it's money that used to come to the government that now is going to, disproportionately rich people.
all right.
Yep. All right. Thanks very much.
that's what
Glad
I
I
was
was able to
wondering.
clear that up for you. Let's go to the phone, 617-830-4750. Why don't we try the 240 area code? That's a dicey one. That can explode, or sometimes there's no one there at 240.
I feel like we're going around the world sometimes. when
Sometimes
do
we
live
are.
calls.
Yeah. Who is it from 240 that's with us?
Hello, is that me?
That's you.
Oh, hi. Oh, hi, David. Well, my name is Adam. Can you hear me? I'm actually on a Bluetooth headset. I remember seeing something about you saying that the reception isn't as good.
Yeah, Bluetooth isn't
Can you hear
good.
me well?
It's the ugly twin to speakerphone for radio calls, but we'll do with it what we can. What's your question, Adam?
Okay, well, mine's a bit of a long question. So,
Oh boy.
have there ever been any bills that can regulate the prices of more, or any bills proposed that could regulate the prices of more common goods, such as food and things like that? I understand that, advocates of a free market will probably lose their heads over something like that. But given that there are, detractors to the whole $15 minimum wage and the whole wage increase activism going on, wouldn't the next best step be to try to regulate prices of, at the very least, the most common goods, so that, those that don't make enough can afford it?
Well, I mean, listen, the way that a lot of that stuff is regulated indirectly, so like farm bills can impact the price of some of our food. We have corn subsidies, heavy corn subsidies, which make products that contain corn cheaper, although
Right.
those are significantly, those are products that aren't, food products that aren't particularly healthy for us. So I think I understand what you're saying, but we already don't really have a free market when it comes to food, in the same way that we don't have a free market when it comes to energy, because we subsidize oil and gas. So I think that it's dangerous territory when you get into that. And it sounds like chaos in the background
Yes.
there. So I appreciate the call. I'm going to let you go, Adam. Point taken and sort of well made, but it seems like you might have a lot that you're juggling there. So I'm going to let you get back to it.
I think someone's writhing in pain over there.
So
There could
it
be a
sounded like
crime
someone was in
going on.
pain. Yeah, I hope that audio is never subpoenaed as evidence in some kind of violent crime. Let's go to the 519 area code. Caller from 519. Who's this?
Hi, it's me.
That's you.
All right. So one of the sorry. My name's Nathaniel, by the way.
All right, go ahead.
And this kind of relates to an earlier question that was asked about Russia and the left.
Yep.
So you're somebody who's clearly on the left, and you're also very concerned about Russian interference in the election. And I'd put myself in a similar camp as you. What do you make of the information indicating that before the Russians backed Trump, they backed Sanders? I don't mean for this to be like a got you thing. I'm just genuinely curious what you make of it, 'cause it sometimes feels like the elephant in the room in these conversations.
I don't know a thing about it. What? Tell me more.
Okay, yeah, there's some articles about, there's one published by Jamie Kirchick. He's a bit of a neoconservative, so he's got a bias, but it's reasonably well sourced. I believe it was it might have been in Tablet. I'm not sure. I think it was tablet. But there's some other information out there that Russia was supporting Sanders, quote supporting Sanders. They're pushing a lot of their propaganda was pro Sanders early on, and then it kind of also then became more pro Trump. But
yeah, I mean, listen. So here's the thing, Nathaniel. I'm limited in sort of what I can say because I've not seen it, but if the idea is to create instability, which is really the broader Russian geopolitical goal, it would make sense that during the primary, you would try to hurt Hillary Clinton by supporting her opponents. And then, because she's sort of, as the establishment candidate, she is the sort of beacon of stability and of sort of non-change in the election. And then once the primary is over and Trump is the Republican nominee and Hillary is the Democratic nominee, the same priority of just creating chaos and instability in the U.S. would have you supporting Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton. So it doesn't sound like there's a confusing logic to it, but I don't know the specifics, so I wouldn't really be able to say more.
All right, yeah. What you just said is pretty much reflects what I think about it. It's just something that hasn't really been talked about that much in liberal circles.
Cool. Are you calling from Canada, by the way?
I am, yeah.
You are? Oh, I thought I picked up on that Canadian accent, which we love, by the way. We love it.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks very much for the call. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm going to look into that. I mean, that's interesting. I want to find out more about that. Let's go next. Where do we go next? I don't even know. I'm thinking we go 224. Let's go to the
please don't.
I can't tell if it's the 224 area code or country code 22, but who is that?
Yo, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Yo, hey, David. It's Alex. I'm from Chicago. So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
For the future of the Libertarian Party, their economic message is complete garbage. Do you think that if they took a more centrist or progressive approach with their economic message, while still keeping in touch with their social libertarian policies that most people seem to like, do you think that they could actually have a shot in the future?
Well, then they'd kind of be Democrats, not libertarians, right? Like, give me an example. So let's imagine. Let's play that out. Libertarians say we're going to have our social libertarian ideas, which already overlap with sort of the moderate left. Give me an example of an economic policy that they would change in order to have broader appeal. Like, what would be one example?
Maybe like Medicare for all, or like something like that. I mean, because
but then they're not libertarians, right? Because libertarians want small government and they want less government involvement. They're not going to say we're libertarians, but we want the biggest possible government health program that we could have, which is the government provides everybody's health insurance. Then they wouldn't be libertarians anymore. You know what I mean?
True. Well, I was referring to more of like a social libertarian message with more of a centrist or almost progressive economic message, because a lot of the Democrats don't really have a libertarian social message, if you catch my drift.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the issue, but I think that the problem is you're focused on some really broad labels, and then you're saying, what if one label basically just changed so it still had the label, but it was something else that we consider Democrat? Like, I don't know. It's a thought experiment, but I don't know how valuable of one it is, because it would basically be the dissolution of libertarians as we know them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I can't say more about it. Appreciate the call. That is all the time we have for today. I know that there are many, many, many people still holding, and I apologize we can't get to everybody today. But we will take calls again, and that will be a very exciting day. And I appreciate that everybody did call in today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Today's classic interview is with Todd Wolfson, and it's stunning how, in retrospect, it was so prescient at the time. The interview was in January of 2015, and the topic was whether there is a cyber right. And this now relates in 2018 to Russian hacking. It relates to MemoGate, as we spoke about earlier in the week with Molly McHugh. It relates to the alt-right's use of the internet. It relates to fake news. At the time when we spoke to Todd Wolfson, a lot of those developments hadn't yet taken place. So let's get to this week's classic interview with Todd Wolfson about the potential of a cyber right from a few years ago. I'm joined today by Todd Wolfson, who's an assistant professor at Rutgers University, co-founder of the Media Mobilizing Project, and also author of the book Digital Rebellion: The Birth of the Cyber Left. This is a really interesting topic, Todd, and I'm curious to start with, do you think that there is a sort of cyber right, or is there something about the internet that is inherently conducive to being used for more progressive causes?
That's a fantastic question, and it's really great to have a chance to talk to you, David. I do think there's something conducive to a progressive movement and the internet, at least, I mean, with a lot of caveats, but the conduciveness is that the internet, as it was developed, has, and as many people mark, has a democratic, participatory nature, which plays very well to both traditional progressive positions and certainly, as we see with things like General Assemblies in the Occupy movement, very much show a parallelism to the contemporary left, or what I'm calling a cyber left. So there is a cyber right. I don't think it's as developed. I think this emerges out of a particular logic, which is much more conducive to a certain form of left-based organizing.
And sometimes we see that come through in particular campaigns. I mean, I remember during the 2008 presidential campaign, John McCain's campaign's use of the internet was just a disaster. And as someone who was kind of engaged with both campaigns as a journalist to see how they each used the tools the internet provided, there was just no comparison at all to the way that President Obama was using it. What's your thought, though, about the kind of anti-net neutrality movement? Because when we step back, the internet to me seems inherently kind of like, as you said, a democratic and even sort of libertarian space, so to speak. And the anti-net neutrality movement seems to me like it would fundamentally change what the internet is.
It definitely would, and obviously net neutrality is a critical policy battle that we have in front of us. It looks, things are looking better today than they did maybe 6 months ago, with the president being a strong proponent, and hopefully that impacting how the FCC chair and the FCC itself acts on this. So I don't know well what's going to happen. Obviously, none of us do, but I do think that having strong net neutrality rules is critical to the sort of left progressive movement that we've seen emerge. And so hopefully it will continue to, and I think you saw, in response to SOPA and PIPA, in response to certain sorts of moves on the around technology policy, that you've seen a certain sort of progressive movement respond to it in a very powerful way. So I think what we've seen is a certain sort of progressive movement develop around net neutrality, but a much broader progressive movement that has a stake in it.
You talk in your book about what you describe as getting sort of lost in cyberspace. And this is something that I've considered a little bit when we talk about groups like Anonymous and their activism, or even a lot of what goes on under the Gamergate hashtag online, which is that sometimes online activism, if it exists only online, can get kind of disconnected from the real world, so to speak, and the way in which people interact offline. Talk about that a little bit. How have you observed that?
Yeah, I mean, this comes out of my research on the indie media movement, which, developed in the late 90s, 99, and was really strong in the mid-2000s. And what I saw in that movement was a desire, and I would say this is based on the class position of those who were primarily in the lead of indie media, at least in the U.S., which I mean to say they were largely middle class, white, college educated. They had technological proficiency, amongst other things. Maybe they had journalistic backgrounds. Maybe they had organizing and activist backgrounds. but they tended to see technology as the solution. So instead of taking technology and embedding it in local struggles, they really worked hard to create really important technological tools. So the indie media websites of 1999 through the early 2000s, I would argue, prefigure Facebook, prefigure Twitter, prefigure the blogging movement. And in fact, one of the programmers that was involved in indie media was one of the programmers involved in the early stages of Twitter. The technology and what they figured out there is quite impressive. But I would argue it comes at the expense of being embedded in strong local communities. The best independent media centers that developed in that movement were ones that were embedded in the community, and those were few and far between. And I think that's a broader emergent logic of contemporary activism. It's a problem, right? And so one that we need to struggle against, and one that we need to find corrective measures for.
Do you think that there are some venues, and maybe the internet is one of them, that simply doesn't lend itself as well to conservative ideology? And I'll give you a couple of examples. Sure. In the midst of the success of The Daily Show, and I think maybe it predated the Colbert Report, but maybe around the same time, Fox News wanted to do a conservative half-hour satirical news show, and they called it the Half-Hour News Hour. And it was a disaster. I mean, it was just a complete disaster. And that started making people think maybe there's something about this type of satire that just doesn't work with conservative ideology. Is internet activism something that you would consider similar to that? In other words, is there something about the internet and conservative ideology that will not work together, or has the right simply not figured it out yet?
I would say there's no absolutes here. I think that the internet is more conducive to a broadly understood progressive politic. But I do think that the right, as the internet changes, as it becomes more corporatized, as the spaces become, as we go back to the net neutrality ruling, as these spaces become more dominated by certain interests, I do think you're going to see development of very strong right trajectory-based movements through the internet. But I think what you're arguing is very, very interesting. Yes, something like The Daily Show is something that plays very well to progressive politic, and then on the converse, something like AM talk radio tends to play more strongly to a conservative politic, and I think that there's a logic and set of practices, problems, and communities of interest that these movements or these programs speak to that make them more conducive to a certain political vision.
I'll remind the audience, the book is Digital Rebellion, The Birth of the Cyber Left. We're speaking with the author, Todd Wolfson. One of the last things I want to talk about with you, Todd, and this is kind of a big thing, is you talk in the book about horizontalism and this idea that often these progressive online movements, and sometimes, even Occupy, which was not an online movement, have a lack of a specific leader. Now, some tout that lack of a specific leader as a good thing. It's democratic. It doesn't allow individuals to sabotage or hold hostage the mission for their own personal gain. But at the same time, it has led to some problems as well, where anybody can sort of wrap themselves with the hashtag or the name of the movement and distract or distort what the message is, and it can often lead to lack of clarity. How can we suss out whether the fact that the internet provides a platform for leaderless movements, is that a positive or negative thing net?
Net, I would say it tracks these days a little bit negative. I think, obviously, this is something to be held in balance. When we look at Occupy or Indie Media, two very horizontal formations, what we see that's so important about what they do is that the horizontalism, the self-organizing aspect, the lack of a centralized structure allows for great growth. Both Indie Media and Occupy grew and developed very quickly and powerfully. A couple things that they don't do. One, they tend to, again, favor the leadership of people with the most social and cultural capital. So when you think about Indie Media or even Occupy, what you don't see is people who have who are the most oppressed, people of color, poor people, immigrants. it's very difficult for them to take the same sort of leadership that white college-educated males generally tend to be able to take, because the invisible structures of power that exist in these sorts of formations tend to dominate, and those favor people who have more social and cultural capital. So an imbalance, I think that's a problem. So I think there are good things about it. It lets us build a sense of identity with the movement when it's deeply democratic. But we have to think about building leaders, actually, I would argue, in these movements. And we may say we want to build 1,000 leaders, but leaderlessness doesn't make sense to me. What makes sense is working with communities that are oppressed and creating political education programs so that we build a clarity, connectedness, competency, and vision of the kind of world we want to create. And horizontality doesn't lend itself to those sorts of politics generally.
We've been speaking with Professor Todd Wolfson. The book is Digital Rebellion, The Birth of the Cyber Left. Very interesting and timely topic, Todd. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, David. I really appreciate it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's time for audience questions. First one is from Bev. Bev says, hey, David, other than impeachment and the 25th Amendment, should there be more ways to remove high-ranking officials, including the president? I have an answer that is not an exact answer to the question. So should there be more ways to remove a high-ranking official, including the president? I think the answer is no. I think we actually already have enough ways to do it. With the president, you've got impeachment, you've got the 25th Amendment. With members of the House, you already have elections every 2 years, right? It's almost like a recall every 2 years. And I know the power of incumbency and money in politics, but those are other issues that we have to deal with. So I don't think we need more means with which we can remove elected officials. I just think that the means we have should be easier to use. And what I mean by that is when you consider the power of incumbency, when you consider the difficulty of impeaching a president, we just want to make sure that the methods we have are real methods. Just having it written into the Constitution that there is a 25th Amendment, unless it's practically speaking usable, it's not actually that useful to have it there. So I would not be against, some people talk, Pat, about we should have the ability, an easier ability to recall a president at any time and do a recall election. I don't really think so. I mean, four-year terms aren't so long, and we do have other means, but we want to make sure that those other means can be used. Senate terms are 6 years. Yeah, 6 years is quite a bit of time, but there are other means for removing senators for wrongdoing.
Yeah.
And in the House, again, it's every 2 years. So I don't think we need more methods. I think we got to make sure that the methods we have can actually be used.
So on the presidential level, I feel as though if you are elected, then you're entitled to serve out those 4 years, barring that you don't commit any high crimes, treason, the things that we're all aware of.
Yeah.
Because the public does know what they're getting themselves into, that they're going to get a certain amount of time out of this presidency. They know how long it's going to be. And as long as they won the election justly, they should be able to serve that out, unless there is some big scandal that the public wasn't aware of.
Circumstance. Yeah. It's possible that in 2010, if it was easy, let's say, for example, you could do a recall election of a president at every midterm, right? So 2008, Obama's elected. 2010, you can do a recall. Obama might have been removed from office in 2010. I mean, it was not a good midterm in 2010. You had the Tea Party. You had earlier still in the recovery from the Great Recession, although it was clearly recovering at that time. You could have had President Obama removed from office in 2010 if we had something like that, ending up serving 2 years instead of 8. And I think we can all agree, particularly in the context of Trump, that that would have not been a very good thing.
And I think it would be a danger to the stability of our democracy if we were able to just recall the president over some minor political issue that we disagreed with him on. I mean, like if Republicans and, the majority at the time of Americans wanted to impeach Obama over Obamacare, we would look back and think that was silly. It's not like we were talking about some, the Teapot Dome scandal or the Watergate scandal or this new Russia scandal. That seems mildly insignificant.
He could have been removed for wearing a tan suit on a day when he talked about serious things. Yeah. Okay, so I think that no, we don't need more mechanisms for the removal of politicians. We need to responsibly be able to use the ones that we have. Laura wrote in, hey, David, are there particular foods that shouldn't be eaten in public or in the company of other people because of their smell, messiness, or for other reasons? Well, the classic example is durian fruit. And people might recall that on producer Lewis's last day on the show, a year and a half ago at this point, he brought in a durian, which is, I don't even know how to describe it. It's a fruit that stinks and that's not even allowed. It's a popular fruit in some Asian countries, and it's not allowed on public transit in a lot of Asian countries. And I sometimes go to an Asian supermarket here in the Boston area because they have a lot of really great stuff. And they sell durian, but it's whole and it's enclosed, so it doesn't have the smell.
Yeah.
So durian is pretty vile. But I think, like, for example, spaghetti with marinara sauce is not the best thing to eat in public. Now, if you're better at it and you know how to use the fork in the spoon to properly wind
I can't do
the
that.
pasta around it,
Yeah,
it's less messy. But spaghetti and marinara can get pretty dicey in public.
Yeah, I'm just imagining sitting across from someone on the subway and they're eating their spaghetti and marinara sauce. I think that would be pretty disturbing to me. And also, the clip of you and Lewis and the crew at the time eating that durian fruit was pretty hilarious. And I have to note that on Lewis's last day, he was not only the producer of the show, he was also the producer of the show.
Yes, he brought in produce. That's pretty clever, yeah. So spaghetti and meatballs, durian. Chicken wings also is generally a messy one, depending on what the sort of sauce is that's on them. If I were early in a relationship and I went on a date, I would certainly try, like, I probably wouldn't get any finger food, like even a burger of any kind, be it veggie, black bean, whatever kind of burger. That can start to get a little bit dicey if it's particularly saucy or anywhere below medium well. You do have to sort of think about it. But as far as smell goes, you know, durian and hard-boiled eggs are two that those can clear a room or a subway car pretty damn quickly.
I think if you have to wear a bib to eat the meal,
it's
a bad sign.
Yeah. So like crab, I think, is probably something you should avoid in a lot of circumstances. Lobster, you know, they have the I forget what it's called, but they like pre-cut the shells for you now so that it's less messy. But I'm very aware of that. And if I'm like at a business meeting or something where I don't want to start drawing attention to myself with messy eating, I'll order selectively. I have this hilarious story where once I had a business meeting in Western Massachusetts, and it was summertime, and the guy I was meeting with said, hey, you know what? Let's go to this ice cream shack it's this great local place. You can get soft serve and we'll sit outside. And we did it. But it was like 95 degrees and there was no shade. You were sitting directly in the sun. Wow. And I had one of those soft serve that's like piled up about a foot, you know, so you have to start taking pieces off the top. It melted so quickly that both of our hands were covered in melted ice cream, and we had to cut the meeting early, and there wasn't even a place to wash your hands. So I remember having to go into like some fast food restaurant just to wash my hands that was nearby or something like that. Disastrous idea for a business meeting.
You know how they ask you if you want it in a cup or a cone?
Yeah.
You got to say both. Then you get more too, and it's far less messy.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's true. That's true. Yeah. Is that typically what you do when you get soy ice cream?
That's been my experience, yeah.
Now, does soy ice cream melt in the same way that regular ice cream does?
Yeah, I mean, it's a cold product, so if you expose it to heat over time, it will start to leak.
Yeah.
I've noticed it's pretty similar. It's not as creamy as regular ice cream.
That's sad.
But it's an experience, I would say.
Yeah. All right, send me your thoughts. Yeah, certainly a lot of foods, but no durian. Do not do the durian thing because it stinks and it's really bad for everybody around you. Tina wrote in, hey, David, how fractured is the Democratic Party right now? This might shock some people. I don't think the Democratic Party is that fractured. I think that there are cracks that are being blown out of proportion. So, like, let me give you an example. And we've talked about this before. A lot of people like to present the Russia situation as a civil war among the left, where you have people who believe that the Russia investigation is nothing and people who believe the Russia investigation is everything and it's going to take down Trump. That's a totally caricatured version of it. Most of the left basically thinks the Russia situation is sketchy and it needs to be fully investigated. But meanwhile, let's keep thinking about 2018 and 2020 and issues and our platform, right? I think the vast majority of the left and the Democratic Party believes that. But it's very profitable. It's very compelling, titillating in some way, to make it seem as though the left is ripping itself apart over the Russia investigation. And it's just not true. Another example, the anti-SJW left versus the SJW left. Yeah. It's not as big of an issue as it's being made out to be. Yes, there are unproductive elements of the left that have taken identity politics and language policing to an extreme that is totally unproductive. It's not a big part of the left, and the truth is it's not playing a major role in the discourse around policy. It's a very loud minority. It's a minority that gets a lot of criticism from the classical liberals and the alt-right and whatever who try to trump it up. But I don't actually think that there's that big of a crack or split among the left.
And it's probably not even a 50-50 split, too.
Oh, no,
it's maybe a 90-10 split, and yet
I would agree.
That 10 is a loud 10.
I don't even think it's 10%. I think it's even smaller than that, but they are very, very loud.
Yeah.
What other issues are there? I mean, economic populism.
More general split between the progressive Bernie Sanders type Democrats and the neoliberal corporate Hillary Clinton type Democrats.
That's more real.
And sometimes you see overlap with those who think that there's some validity behind the Russia investigation. Like those who supported Bernie in the primaries may think that he was robbed, and therefore this Russia stuff is a distraction. And then there's people who support Hillary Clinton who think that she would have won had Russia not interfered.
Right.
So that's more important to them.
But the thing is, among those who connect the Russia story to either Bernie or Hillary winning in the DNC, there is definitely a split. But I believe that that's just a small percentage of the Democratic Party at large and the left at large. Like, I voted for Bernie in the primary and I voted for Hillary Clinton in the general election. And I don't believe that the Trump-Russia story in any way influences how good of a candidate Bernie was and how good of a candidate Hillary Clinton was. It's just a totally different thing. It has nothing to do with that specifically. So I think it's important not to overstate the split or fracturing of the Democratic Party because it's counterproductive. If you believe that the party is super fractured, then you are also probably going to focus on the wrong issues in thinking about how the framing and positioning should be set up for 2018 or 2020. So don't be tricked into thinking that there's this major fracture.
And the thing is, even if the party is fractured, that's not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to making gains for the next election cycles.
Arguably so.
Like Republicans in 2010, they had a split between the more mainstream Republicans and the Tea Party wing, and yet they still took control of the House in 2010.
Right.
Or by the time 2014 came around, you had people like Ted Cruz, who are a lot more out there and vocal and shut the government down, and yet still they won the Senate that year.
That's important.
You can still be productive when there's a fraction in your party.
Fracturing can also be called diversity of opinions.
Yes.
And if that diversity of opinion is not used to exclude people from, quote, the left, then arguably it's a good thing because there are more entryways of appeal to people to become part of the Democratic Party or the left. And again, I've never been a Democrat, but I certainly am staunchly on the left. And I think that there are lots of different sets of ideas that still qualify as being on the left, and some illiberal ones, which we've pointed out as well, which I think should not be part of the left.
Yeah, it works as long as you can keep it cordial and think of it as everyone being under the same umbrella with the same goals. Although sometimes we see that that's not possible.
Sometimes it doesn't happen, and that's not good, right? And when you start actually getting people who are going to end up voting for, people on the far, far, far left that have no chance of winning and are arguably destructive, or just voting for Republicans, that's when it becomes damaging. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We will talk about Larry Nassar. We will talk about the plan for next week, and many, many other important things. Get access to the bonus show by signing up at davidpakman.com/membership or at patreon.com/davidpakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.